All right, thank you. This is our IEP, Basics and Beyond training. I'm going to start with screen sharing. And on your screen, you should see the sections of the IEP. I will not read them again, but they are listed here, and we will be going through each of these as we talk about IEPs this evening. The first section of an IEP is the student demographic and team meeting information. This is that part of the IEP where hopefully they give it to you and they ask you, Mom, Dad, check over this. Does this look right to you? Is all the student information correct? It'll be name, birth date, address, contact information. It's a time to take a minute and make sure that your email address is correct, that the phone number that you have listed as your contact information is correct. It will list the meeting date for the IEP. It will list the date of implementation, meaning when is the IEP going to go into effect, and the duration of services. Usually that's 1 year, but it could be less if you're having a meeting like halfway through the year as an update point. Then in that case, it would usually use your anniversary date as the duration of services. Any revisions to the IEP that occurred without a meeting are listed in the student demographic section. So that's, let's say you have a student who's working on a particular goal, they've mastered it, maybe they're reading passages at 85% accuracy at the 3rd grade level. The teacher might call you and say, hey, little Johnny has mastered his goal with reading comprehension on the 3rd grade level. I'd like it to bump it up to the 4th grade level. Are you okay with that? You say, yeah, that sounds great. Makes perfect sense. Let's do that. You don't necessarily bring a whole team together to do that. You just make the revision. The school will typically send you an email or something to sign that says you made the revision. But then when you come back to meet, that will be listed on the IEP as a revision that was made without a meeting. That'll be listed in the demographic section. This is where you'll get your notice of procedural safeguards, and there will also be a medical assistance program billing notice. So this is all in that very first section of the IEP. The members of the IEP team: parents or guardian. A regular education teacher should be present at all IEP team meetings unless you excuse them. If your child is receiving any instruction in general education, or if they may be in the future. A special education teacher, a local education agency representative. This can be a principal. It can be a special ed supervisor, a special education consultant, a special education director. Basically, the LEA representative is somebody who can commit resources. The LEA representative needs to be a decision maker, somebody who can come to the meeting and say, yes, we can do this. Yes, we have the support. I can make the contact to make sure your child receives it. So this person is important because they have the ability to commit resources to the child's IEP. A person who can interpret evaluation results. So if you're talking about a recent evaluation, there's usually a school psychologist who is present to go over the results. If there's been a speech evaluation, it would be a speech pathologist, occupational therapy, physical therapy, depending on what results need to be interpreted. The student, when appropriate, at the age of 14, a student is expected to be invited to their IEP meeting and to attend if possible. But students sometimes will come when they're younger than 14, if it's appropriate and if your student wants to participate. And related service providers when their areas of expertise are discussed. So again, related service providers could be the speech pathologist, the occupational therapist, a physical therapist. If you are going to have one of those or more of those areas talked about at your IEP meeting, then those providers should be present at the meeting. And others that are requested by the parent or guardian. So that could be an advocate. I'm at the ARC. One of the things that I do very often is attend IEP meetings to support families when there might be some type of uncertainty about the outcome of of a team meeting. You might want to take your neighbor, a family member, just somebody to have extra support, because a lot of times the team meetings can feel, IEP team meetings can feel like there's a whole room full of people on one side, and then there you are as a parent on the other. So you are welcome to invite anyone that you choose as a support for you at the IEP. All right, procedural safeguards notice. I have the link here for the procedural safeguards notice. And if you are interested in receiving the PowerPoint or the links that are contained in it, you can just let me know in the chat. And I'm happy to send these out. This is the link to the procedural safeguards notice. This is important, and it is something that will be offered to you at every IEP meeting. Sometimes it's a booklet. I used to have the booklet attached to my bulletin board here. That's why I was looking, but it can be a booklet, it can just be a packet of information. It includes a list of all of your rights as a parent, and what you should do if you disagree with an IEP team's determination. I have it linked here in the PowerPoint. And like I said, I'm happy to send you that link so that you can access your procedural safeguards, but your school should be offering them to you at every IEP meeting. A lot of times they kind of make light of it. Like they'll say, oh, you probably have 100 of these. I've heard you can probably wallpaper your bedroom with these, but these are very important because they do outline for you all of your rights as a parent through the IEP process. And when a school offers them to you, they will ask you to either sign that you received them or sign, yes, they offered them to me, but I decided not to take them because I do have a collection at home, and so I declined this time. But that's something that will be offered at every meeting. The medical assistance billing program billing notice is, again, right in that very first section of the IEP. And this is important because a lot of times families are confused about what this means. Families must provide consent before the school district can access the child or parent's public or private insurance for the first time. What this does is allow schools to access a special fund operated and through the state, through medical assistance for therapies like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, audiology services, vision therapy services. It's a special fund that does not impact your child's ability to use their benefits outside of school. So sometimes parents are concerned, oh, if I sign this and let the school bill medical assistance, my child won't be able to get outpatient services. That is not accurate. It will not decrease your available coverage at any point. It's not considered double dipping. It's a completely different fund. It is through medical assistance, but not through the same fund that funds private insurances. So it will not cause you any decrease in benefits. It will not put you at risk or your child at risk for accessing community-based services such as waivers. And a school can't require you to apply for these benefits, but it does help them by giving them access to additional funds to support your student. So again, that's right there in the first part of the IEP. All right. Special considerations. The IEP team must consider all of these questions before developing an IEP. And again, you've probably heard them before, and in some cases, IEP teams can go over them pretty quickly. The first question is the student blind or visually impaired? And there are some examples here of exactly what that means when they ask, is a student blind or visually impaired? So this would be a considerable visual impairment that impacts their ability to learn. It's not just, does your child, wear glasses? But is there a significant visual impairment that affects learning? Sometimes my arrow is working and sometimes it's not. I apologize. Is the student deaf or hard of hearing? And again, if the answer is yes, then some things to consider would be, what's the student's typical mode of communication? Does the student need an interpreter? Are there opportunities for the student to communicate with their general education population? Is there opportunity for direct instruction in the student's preferred method of language or preferred method of communication? Is there an assistive technology need? What mode of communication is used at home? So these are all considerations that would be discussed by the IEP team if a student is deaf or hard of hearing. Does the student have communication needs? Now, again, these are questions that are at the beginning of an IEP that typically you'll go through pretty quickly. But if there's a chance that one of these questions does apply to your learner, I suggest that you slow down and take a moment to make sure that it's being fully considered. What's the student's typical mode of communication? Is the student understood by others, especially with unfamiliar communication partners? So if you have a child and you can understand what they say most of the time, that's great, but consider, do other people who don't know my child, are they able to understand my child? What opportunities exist to foster communication skills with others? So if you have a student who has limited verbal skills, are they still having opportunities to be with their peers who are talking, who have higher levels of verbal skills? Do the student's communication skills impact learning? Does a student require assistive technology? And what kind of communication is used at home? So if you have a student who has a speech device that they're using at home, are they also using that at school? Or vice versa, if they're using a speech device at school, but they're not sending it home for you to use at home, well, that would be something that you definitely would want to discuss at the IEP team meeting. Does the student need assistive technology devices and or services? So does the student need this in order to meaningfully participate in the general education curriculum or to participate in other academic or functional activities? Does a student need assistive technology to access print material or auditory information? For example, if your student isn't a very strong reader, could they do they need access to audiobooks in order to be able to access the lessons? Do they need AT for written communication or computer access? For example, if they're not strong with handwriting, can they use speech to text? Can they type? Does the student need technology for augmentative and alternative communication? Those are AAC devices. In our house, we call that a talker. I do have a son who uses a talker to communicate. And do they need assistive technology devices or services to participate in state and local assessments? I want you to think carefully before you answer no to this question, because a lot of times I see families checking the no box. No, if they don't need something obvious like a talker, they check the no box. Well, consider the fact that our students have all kinds of technology available to them. And sometimes an IEP team's answer will be, well, sure, they can use OneNote to take notes for them, but all students have access to that. So it's not really assistive technology in the IEP sense. But if your student really depends on that in order to be able to access their education, to be able to follow along, to be able to keep up with the lessons, then you should be checking the box and saying, yes, we do need assistive technology. Yes, my student does need to type. Yes, my student does need to use talk to text. Yes, my student does need to listen to audiobooks because their reading comprehension is an area where they struggle. So there are a lot of things that can be considered assistive technology under the special consideration questions. Under special considerations, there are also additional assistive technology considerations. Has there been an evaluation of need? If you have a student with a disability, when is the last time that he or she had an evaluation to see if there is any benefit to bringing in assistive technology? Is there assistance needed for purchasing, for leasing, for acquiring the device? Schools have folks trained in the ability to be able to help families get access to assistive technology. Do they need assistance selecting, designing, fitting, customizing, and adapting? Lancaster, Lebanon, IU13 has something called a TAC team. They're the technical assistance folks. They can help modify devices, not just speech devices, but all kinds of assistive technology to support students in a variety of ways. So if you think that there's a possibility that assistive technology could benefit your student, ask for an assistive technology evaluation and make sure they're reaching out to IU13 for those supports. And if a student is using assistive technology, you want to make sure that those supports are available in all settings, right? So not just when your student is in the special education classroom, but when they are in the general education classroom, when they go to gym for PE class, when they're on the playground for recess, do they have access to take that technology to help them in extracurricular activities? Can they take their technology home or have access to that technology when they're outside of school? And other things to consider are training and technical assistance. And this is for the student, for the family, and for any of the professionals working with the student. If your child has access to technology at school, they should be trained in how to use it. But you also, as a parent, can be trained by school personnel on how to use your child and to help your child use that technology. The next question at the beginning of the IEP is, does the student have limited English proficiency? This question exists to make sure that we are not diagnosing a learning disability or other disability when the difficulty is really related to the acquisition of a second language. And so if we have a student who is truly an English language learner, we want to make sure that we are supporting them in acquiring their second language and not confusing that with a potential disability. And so you take a look at what's the first language the student learned to speak, what languages are spoken in the home. Is the English language teacher a part of the IEP team to be able to say, we're seeing this problem in their primary language and in English, so perhaps there is a problem related to disability that would require special education supports. And again, considering how are these supports going to be delivered across all settings, and also a plan for what language will be used to communicate with parents and family if the student is not primarily English speaking. Another question, again, right at the beginning of the IEP, does the student exhibit behaviors that impede his or her learning or that of others? So a lot of students have behavioral problems. I mean, you probably could go into a classroom and find all kinds of behaviors that are popping up, whether students have disabilities or not. But this is really about behaviors that affect a student's ability to learn or are disruptive enough that they cause other students to have difficulty learning when the child's in the classroom. So have there been informal strategies that just haven't worked? Do assessments indicate that the behavior is really a result in deficits in communication or deficits in academic skills, right? Kids who are acting up in math class because they simply don't know how to do the work because they're struggling with a learning disability in math. Has the student lost access to instructional time due to in-school disciplinary referrals or suspension from school? So these are the things to consider when you're deciding whether or not to check the box yes or no to the question, does the student exhibit behaviors that impede his or her learning or that of others? Has the student's behavior contributed to the consideration of a more restrictive placement? This is important to keep in mind, not just in this section of the IEP, but throughout. Behavior is something that often impacts a student's ability to learn and to be successful in school. However, we need to make sure that we're understanding the function of that behavior, and we'll talk about that again a little bit later. And also, if we are considering moving a student to a more restrictive educational placement because of their behavior, we need to make sure that we have had a good assessment to determine the function of the behavior, and also that there's a positive behavior support plan in place to help the student. And we're not just simply jumping right to, let's take them out of the class and put them somewhere else without actually getting to the bottom of what the behavior, what's causing the behavior and how we can best address it. All right, that is the first section of the IEP. And I know it's a section that we sometimes rush through in our meetings when we have IEP meetings, but there's a lot of really important stuff in there. Before I go to section 2, I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions. Okay. The second section of an IEP is called the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. In this part of the IEP, you will see a summary of the student's performance in his or her educational program, including instructional and functional levels. So this is, what's my student doing now? How's he doing in all of the things that you're trying to teach him? This provides baseline data for developing the IEP. So this is where we are now. It provides a baseline so we can build on that and know where we want to go. It must address any of those special considerations identified in section 1. So if you said yes to any of those questions, yes, my child is deaf or hard of hearing, yes, my child has behavior that impacts his learning, yes, my child has the need for assistive technology, anything that you may have answered yes to in those previous questions have to be addressed here in the present levels of the IEP. The present levels will also give you the current progress towards the student's annual goals. So this part of the IEP is really supposed to be a pretty good overview of how things are going right now. If your child has had a functional behavioral assessment, which we will call an FBA for short, it should be included in this section of the IEP. If your student is 14 or older, any transition goals should also be summarized here in the present levels. Again, it's a snapshot of what's going on now so we can build a clear picture about where we are and plan for where we're going. Parental concerns. This might be my favorite part of an IEP. I always advise parents to make sure that you are using the parental concerns section of an IEP. If your child has an IEP, I encourage you, when we're done tonight, to go and look at your child's most current IEP to see in section 2 where it says parental concerns, if there are any concerns listed. Very often, parents find it's blank, it says no concerns, or it says concerns will be discussed at the meeting. Now, that's okay if you don't have any concerns or you discuss them all at the meeting. But more often than not, what I find is parents say, how can that say I have no concerns? I went to the meeting and I had all of this whole list of things I wanted to talk about. Parental concerns is a very powerful tool. It gives you an opportunity to put into your own words what's on your mind regarding your child's IEP and education. It also makes your concerns part of the permanent record. So for example, if you're concerned that your child has not had enough opportunities to interact with his general education peers, you could bring that up as a parental concern. What's supposed to happen is that then that gets documented in the IEP. Parent expressed concerns that student does not have opportunities to interact with his same age non-disabled peers. It's part of the document. Now, because that was brought up as a parental concern, the IEP team should be saying, well, how can we address that through this IEP to make sure that child is having more opportunities to interact? So ideally, when you bring up that concern, it's supposed to be addressed in the IEP. Also, if let's say in 6 months you have to come together for a meeting and you say, he's still not having any opportunity with his general education peers, the team should not come back to you and say, I didn't know that was a concern. Well, of course they knew it was a concern. You had it documented 6 months ago when you were in that IEP meeting. So it does serve as a record for the things that are important to you and to make sure that they get acted upon, and also to serve as a reference when you say, listen, we've been talking about this for 6 months or a year, and I'm still not seeing any changes. So it's a good point of reference in the future, should there be a problem trying to come to a solution that everybody agrees on. So definitely take a look. Are your parental concerns listed? What I do personally, because I'm also a parent and I have children with IEPs, I draft my parental concerns myself in my own words, and I send them to the special education teacher that drafts the IEP, and I ask them, please list my parental concerns unredacted in the section of in the appropriate section of the IEP. I like the concerns to be in my words and not a summary of what the teacher takes down in the meeting, but you can do whatever, whatever you prefer. If you would just like them to make a summary of the concerns and ask them to add that, that would be fine. Or you can ask them to put them in your own words. Also in the present levels of academic achievement are statements about the student's involvement and progress with the general education curriculum. So if your child is having opportunities to access the general education curriculum, and they should be having those opportunities, it would be listed here in the present levels. Present levels also contains another really important part of an IEP called strengths and needs. This is the part where they talk about what a child's strengths are and what their needs are. One of my favorite stories about this particular part of the IEP is I was working with a particular family, and the student was getting an IEP for the first time. And the team met, and the team leader said, some of students' strengths are, and gave a pretty nice list, and then moved on. About two sentences into the next part that the special ed consultant was going through, the parent stopped and said, "I'm sorry, could I interrupt you for just a minute? I have some more strengths that I'd like you to list about my child." And I just thought that was the best moment ever, because so much of what we do in special education talks about a student's deficits, areas where they struggle, things that are challenges, things that they need assistance with. I just loved that this parent wanted to bring the whole team back to focus on, hey, my kid has some other strengths, and I think they should be listed in this document. So take a few minutes, when you're preparing for an IEP meeting, and really think about, what are my child's strengths and what do I think the IEP team needs to know about my child? The needs of the students that are identified in the present levels of an IEP are also very important, because if it's identified in the present levels, it needs to be addressed in the IEP. So once the team identifies a need, it's the IEP team's job to then make sure those needs are appropriately addressed throughout the document. All right, this is time where we're going to change gears just a little bit, because we're talking about all this heavy duty section 1, section 2 of the IEP. And we're going to talk about how you as a parent can really bring something special to the IEP team about your child, to keep the focus on the child. And I really love this quote by Henry Winkler, and I think it's good for all of us to remember. How you learn has nothing to do with how brilliant you are. And we as parents really know that there is so much more to our child than just a bunch of scores from evaluations and assessments. And that is why I recommend that all families create some type of one-page profile for their child. Can everybody see this? I switched screens and I'm never sure if I have to stop sharing or if it just goes through. Everybody see this okay?
Yes, it's good.
Perfect. So this is just an example of a one-page profile. This is also included if I think everybody on here said that they did want the links. This is included in the links. You can use something like this, or it can be something else that you make. The little box I'm pointing, and of course you can't see it, I'll use my cursor. The little box here is for a picture, because you want people to see that smiling face and know that your kiddo is a lot more than just a file or a school report. And so there's a spot for a name, for age, for grade. And these are some really easy but really valuable bits of information for you to jot down and make sure that your child's team and anybody who's working with your child has. What people appreciate about me, what's important to me, and how to support me. So this is a great way to talk about, what are your child's strengths? What do people love about them? What do people appreciate about them? What's important to your child? And how to best support them. I love this. It's easy to update. So as your child gets older and what's important to him or her changes, you can just, do a quick update. I think it's really great to give this to everybody on the IEP team, any therapists that are working with your child, anybody who's coming into their life to support them, to kind of get a snapshot of them. That's something that comes from family and not just from a bunch of evaluation reports and tests and things like that. All right, let's see if I can magically go back to, there we go. All right.
You're good.
Awesome. All right, that covers section 2 of the IEP. Any questions on that before we move into transition? Excellent. All right. All right, transition services. Transition services must begin no later than the first IEP that will be in effect when the student turns 14. So when we talk about transition services, we are talking about the very big transition from school age services to adult services, graduation and moving on into independent living. In Pennsylvania, we start transition at age 14. Federal law requires that transition begin at 16, but in Pennsylvania, our law actually requires us to start it a bit earlier, which I think is great. You can never start planning too early for transition. An IEP must contain appropriate measurable post-secondary goals related to training, education, employment, and independent living where appropriate. Now, I say where appropriate because there are students who have IEPs for speech needs or maybe even physical therapy needs. There are times when independent living is not really a concern because our student has skills pretty typical to their peers in terms of their ability to live independently. So sometimes independent living is not addressed in an IEP because it simply isn't a concern. An IEP should contain a specific course of study. It's supposed to be study in content areas that are intended to assist the student in reaching post-secondary goals. So any course that a child is taking that is intended to help them with life after high school should be listed here specifically. They don't want generalizations. They don't want you to put things like college prep or technical. They want very specific things. For example, one of my sons who has an IEP is taking a class this year called Personal Finance and Literacy. Oh boy, is that a fun class, but it's a really important class. And obviously it's related to transition from high school because personal finance and literacy is something that's really important. Sometimes students are taking food science classes. Sometimes they are taking classes related to money management on a more basic level than personal finance and literacy. Maybe they're working on building counting money skills. Maybe they're working on learning to read appropriate community signs, like to be able to navigate themselves in the community, to find exits and restrooms. It really depends on the level of your student, but anything that is specifically focused on life after high school should be listed here. Interagency responsibilities should be listed here. So if there is an outside agency that you are working with or should be working with, they are listed here. And some examples of that are the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, which is OVR, Lancaster or Lebanon County or your local county if you're not from here, Office of Behavioral Health Disability Services. Sometimes it's called Mental Health Intellectual Disability. Each county has its own office for that, and sometimes their names are slightly different, but they are basically the county offices responsible for supporting individuals with disabilities throughout the lifespan. And any other agencies really that are listed here. It could be a community social worker who's involved with a community health plan, something like that. Any other agency that's going to be supporting the individual after high school would be listed here under transition services. The team should be focusing on education and training, post-secondary employment, and independent living. So again, transition is really focused around those things, and they are required to collect data on the things listed here on the slide. Things like work-based learning, paid work experience, job exploration, job career development, and any IEP modifications that support work-based learning opportunities. And all of this data is collected because there was a change in law in 2016 with Act 26, which is called the Work Experience for High School Students with Disabilities Act. This really raised attention to how important it is for students to have opportunities to explore paid competitive employment while they are still in school, in order to be able to support them in that endeavor after school. And as a result, there is a reporting requirement for this. So IEP teams are taking a lot of data about the kinds of work experience that students have access to during the time that they're in school. Questions about transition. I could do an entire session just about transition. In fact, I think I probably have, and I know we have some transition training opportunities coming up in the future through the Lancaster, Lebanon local task force for the right to education. The ARC will push out those trainings when they're happening, and they focus just on that piece of 14 and older, what IEPs should be focusing on, how to best support your learner to transition to successful, adult services. So I know it's a really big topic, but in terms of how it relates to the IEP, does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, great. Participation, the next section of the IEP is all about participation in state and local assessments. This is where you will see the section about what accommodations are going to be provided to my student if they have to take state or local assessments. In this section of the IEP, it will tell you what grade levels these assessments are conducted in. Most of you, well, I shouldn't say, but many of you have likely heard of PSSAs, Pennsylvania assessments. The letters are escaping me now. Pennsylvania, but they're the standardized assessments that students take, I believe, in third, fifth and eighth grade, I think, are PSSA testing years. In the high school, students take Keystone exams, which you may have heard of. So those are the kind of state level assessments that they're talking about. Local assessments, that doesn't necessarily mean your spelling test on Friday, but local assessments might be those more major blocks of testing that schools are doing to determine if kids are reading on grade level, if kids are doing math on grade level, if they need supports in other areas. There should be determination in this section. It will include the determination if a student is participating in PASA instead of PSSAs. So PSSAs is the standardized testing that most students across the Commonwealth take. PASA is the Pennsylvania alternate state assessment. And a very small percentage of students who have significant disabilities that usually are those students with significant cognitive delays, significant communication deficits take the PASA. But if your student is going to take the PASA, that would be listed in this part of the IEP. There are certain accommodations that are allowed by the PSSA. So there are certain things you can put in an IEP to support a student taking standardized tests, and there are certain things that you cannot. I thought rather than go through the list here, I would provide the link for those allowable accommodations for PSSAs. And then the link below that is the criteria for determining if a student is eligible to take PASA instead of the PSSA. Because there are very specific criteria that a student must meet in order to be eligible to take the PASA. And it is a very small amount of our students. So all of the information about how to qualify, how to make that determination related to PASA is on the link. All right, I think this is where we start to really get into the meat and potatoes of an IEP. Not that all of those things aren't important, and it really is a good thing to understand what all of those pages are about. But goals and objectives is a lot of times the place, I think one of two things happens. One, it's the place everybody wants to flip to in the IEP and see, well, what are the goals? What are we working on? And two, sometimes it's the part of the IEP where by the time we finally get to the goals and objectives, we've already been in the meeting for 45 minutes and we only have 15 more minutes and we have to quickly rush through them. And so that's kind of unfortunate because it really is an important part of an IEP. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which most of the time you'll hear referred to as IDEA, and the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is ESSA, mandates that students, including those with disabilities, must have access to the general education curriculum. So I'm going to repeat that. Must have access to the general education curriculum. Not might, not may, not can if they are able to do this, this, and this. Must have access to the general education curriculum. The curriculum for students eligible for the PASA, so that's that Pennsylvania Alternative State Assessment, should be aligned with grade level standards and alternate eligible content. So if you have a student who has a higher level of need and is eligible for PASA, they should still be having educational opportunities that are aligned to what's called alternative eligible content. So it doesn't mean that they aren't studying anything related to the general education curriculum. It means that curriculum is modified to support our learners with highest level of need. All goals, both academic and functional, must be specific and measurable. And they should describe what reasonable expectations can be accomplished in a 12-month period. So when you come together and you write that goal, what you are saying is, in the next year from now, 12 months from now, so if we're meeting in November, next November, it's reasonable to expect that my students should be able to do the following, and then list it. So you are looking at, what do we hope to accomplish within a year? Annual goals are required for areas that are directly affected by the student's disability. So goals should be related to a student's needs based on their disability. Every IEP should describe how progress will be measured and when progress will be reported. So in this section, section 5, where the goals are, it should tell you, this is how often we're checking for progress, and this is how often we're reporting progress. And that's important. Like, do you want to see, I've seen this in IEPs, progress will be checked 3 times per year. That's all? You're really only going to check to see that we're making progress 3 times a year? I understand you might report the progress 3 times per year if you have trimester report cards, but you're really only going to assess that that's when we're making how we're making progress. So it's important to take a look there and make sure you're comfortable with how often they're going to be checking in to make sure that your student is learning what they're supposed to be learning. Short-term objectives or benchmarks are required for students who take an alternate assessment, such as the PASA. So if you have one of those learners with a high level of need, each goal will have what's called short-term objectives. So instead of saying, well, not instead of, but in addition to saying, in a year, this student will identify all 26 upper and lowercase letters. But because it's a learner with complex needs who's eligible to take the PASA, the alternative state assessment, we're going to provide benchmarks, which says at the end of the first trimester, the student's going to identify all lowercase letters. By the end of the second trimester, the student is going to identify all lowercase level letters and 13 of the uppercase letters. And then the final benchmark would be being able to identify all lower and uppercase letters with 95% accuracy. So it breaks the goal down into smaller measurable steps, but that is only done typically for students who are taking the PASA, the alternate assessment. All right. Before we go into related services, I'll pause and see if there are questions about goals and objectives. I'm also going to get a little sip of my water because I've been doing a lot of talking. All right, well, I'm hoping you don't have questions because this has been very thorough and not because it's dark outside and cold and you're all curled up with a blanket napping. All right, goals and objectives leads us to Section 6. Special education related services, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications. And just so you know, these are all sections that come right from the Pennsylvania Department of Education Bureau of Special Education template for IEPs. I didn't come up with these really long, fancy titles. These are exactly what the sections are that you will see on your students' IEPs. This section 6 is broken down into some subcategories, and A is program modifications and specially designed instruction. If you've had IEP meetings or you've been to them or talked about them, you have probably heard these referred to as SDIs, specially designed instruction. The goals in an IEP tell us what our child is going to be working on, what they're going to be doing. These specially designed instructions tell us how they're going to do it and how they're going to be supported so that they can reach those goals. So an SDI means adapting the content, method, or delivery of instruction. SDIs address the unique needs of the student. So they are always supposed to be based on what does this particular student need. They ensure access to the general education curriculum, and they may include providing instructional materials in alternate accessible formats. So specially designed instruction could mean Braille, audio, digital, large print. Anything like that is considered specially designed instruction. Supplementary aids and services are provided in regular education classes, other education-related settings, and in extracurricular and non-academic settings to enable students with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled students to the maximum extent appropriate. So I think there are these two things, specially designed instruction and supplemental aids and services, are both very important, but they are different in that specially designed instruction can happen anywhere. It can happen in general education math class. It can happen in an emotional support classroom. It can happen in PE. It can happen in an adapted art class. Specially designed instruction can happen anywhere to support the student. Supplementary aids and services are supports that are specifically happening in general education environments, or what they call non-academic settings. So that would be a school activity with non-disabled peers that's not specifically an academic thing. Assemblies, club time, extracurricular activities, those types of things. That is what SAS, supplementary aids and services, are designed for, supporting students in general education settings. So SDIs can happen anywhere. SAS happens in gen ed. A framework for special supplementary aids and services is now called FAB. Special ed, we love acronyms. SAS is now called FAB, which is the framework for access and belonging. They love the name. I'm still getting used to it. But there is a lot of really great information. I linked here the FAB site, which talks all about the kinds of supplementary aids and services that students can be provided in order to spend more time with their general education peers in non-special ed settings. So it's all about supporting students in settings other than in special education classrooms. So that's what FAB is about. And so that's linked there. It's a lot of great resources. Again, we could probably do an 1.5-hour session just talking about framework for access and belonging and how to best include students and support them in general education, which is why I linked it there so that you could get more information about it. Part B of section 6 of the IEP is related services. This is where you will see things like transportation. A lot of students who are receiving special education will get curb-to-curb transportation because it suits them better than riding a big school bus with all of their peers. Speech, PT, OT, counseling services, school health services if you have a child with complex medical needs. that needs medication administered, that needs regular nurse check-ins for any variety of things. That would be included in a related services. Yes, the school nurse can be part of an IEP team. Behavior intervention programs can be under related services. Interpretation services, whether for the student or for the family, and audiology, mobility, vision services. Those are all considered related services. It's not an all-inclusive list. Anything that comes up that is necessary for the student to access their education that doesn't fall under specially designed instruction, typically then would fall under the related services category of the IEP. Supports for school personnel. This is included in section 6 of the IEP, listed under supports for school personnel. That's literally the section on the IEP. This is an important part. If you have a child who, like my son, uses a speech device to communicate, his IEP, we spelled it out. His teacher needs to go and be trained in LAMP. LAMP's the particular program that he uses to communicate. We needed to make sure that there was at least one paraprofessional trained in LAMP, because if you have people working with your student and they don't understand the way they communicate, they're not going to have effective communication partners. So something like that can be listed in an IEP. If your child uses special equipment, whether it's for mobility, for feeding support, if they have hearing aids that are connected to FM systems, which are moving out and they're more Bluetooth related now, you can make sure that the IEP addresses training for school personnel, because there have to be people working with your child who knows how to use the equipment, how to charge things, how to reattach things if they become disconnected. All kinds of things like that can be listed under the supports for school personnel. Assistive technology training. Continuing education is listed here as well. So you will see some general things listed here, like every paraeducator has to have 20 hours of continuing education credits, or 20 hours of continuing education training provided by the school district. Those are the kinds of things that you will typically see in an IEP under supports for school personnel, but that's not all that should be there. If there are trainings specific to your student that would benefit the team, his or her team, whether it's related to communication or behavior or feeding or whatever it is, it should be listed under supports for school personnel. I skipped D, and you might notice, C, I went to E. D is all about gifted supports, and I decided not to go into gifted supports tonight because, one, it can be kind of time consuming, and two, I was going to focus on things related to special education services only tonight. If you do have specific questions related to gifted services or students who are considered twice exceptional, meaning they're gifted and have a disability, please reach out to me or our info email address at the ARC, and I will make sure to get you more information related to gifted services. But I'm skipping that and going to extended school year. This again is another topic that we really could spend an evening on. And we do have, I will make sure to send it out when I send out the links. We do have a parent information session, I think, coming up. It might actually be this coming Monday on extended school year through the Lancaster, Lebanon local task force for the right to education. But just to do some highlights here, because extended school year is listed in section 6 of the IEP. There are 7 factors that must be considered when determining eligibility for ESY. It is not just about regression and recoupment. It is not just about regression and recoupment. You will always hear discussion about regression and recoupment. Regression is my student loses skills when we're on a break. Recoupment is this is the amount of time it takes my student to regain those skills that were lost while we were on the break. All students lose skills, even kids who do not have disabilities. They go home over the summer, they forget things they learned. The teacher reviews key concepts at the beginning of the school year to get everybody refreshed and back on track. It happens to all of our learners. Students with disabilities often lose skills, a greater number of skills, and it often takes them longer to recoup or regain those skills. But ESY is not just based on regression and recoupment. Other factors that must be considered include whether the student's disability is severe, and it gives some examples that the state uses to consider that the state considers severe, and the extent to which a skill or behavior is particularly crucial for the student to meet the IEP goals of self-sufficiency and independence from caretakers. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that one. If you think that your child is going to need additional supports in order to gain independent skills, you should, I highly recommend, having a goal related to those independent living skills. It doesn't have to be every skill that you think your child will need. Start small and have goals on an IEP related to independent living. Not just living alone by themselves as an adult, but requiring less support from a caregiver. One of the reasons those are important is obviously one of the reasons that's important is because independent living is a goal that we have for all of our children someday to live independently, but also independent living goals are something that can be focused on in ESY, extended school year. And one of the 7 factors that you are supposed to consider when determining if a child is eligible for ESY is based specifically on, is there an IEP goal that's crucial to independent living? So if you don't have a goal for independent living on your IEP, then this factor is not going to come up in conversation when you're considering, does my child need ESY? Well, there should be an independent living goal in your IEP. That way, when the school would like to talk about regression and recoupment, you can say, well, in addition to regression and recoupment, I would like to talk about a skill that's particularly crucial to support independent living. That's another reason we should be talking about ESY. Eligibility determination for ESY is supposed to be made by February 28th, and there's supposed to be a NOREP, a notice of recommended educational placement, issued by March 31st. In most cases, sometimes some students, the notification can come later. For example, if you have a student who just has a speech IEP, there's not a severe communication delay, it's something minor. Those students, they sometimes will push those ESY determinations out till closer to the end of the year. But for most students, ESY determinations are made in February with the NOREP issued by the end of March. And an ESY and extended school year can focus on academics, related services, and we talked about related services that include speech, OT, and PT. They can also work on peer socialization, but it has to be goals that the student was working on during the school year. So extended school year is not about introducing new goals. It's about working on goals the student already is working on. Now, I said there were 7 factors. Yeah, I didn't go over all 7 of them, again, because it gets lengthy, but at the end, I have a few resources linked, and one of them that I have linked is for extended school year, and it outlines very specifically what those 7 factors are. But the important takeaway for tonight, I think, is ESY is about more than just regression and recoupment, even though that's what you'll hear. Questions about section 6 of the IEP. This is a pretty dense information part of the IEP. So if you have any questions about it, I'm happy to answer them. Okay. I'm going to go with thorough as opposed to napping, and we'll go to section 7, which is educational placement. I think it's important as a starting point for educational placement to say special education is a service, not a place. It's not a location. So placement in IEP language does not necessarily refer to a location, although obviously that's part of the conversation, right? Where is this class Where is this school? Where is the building that this is going to happen? But educational placement refers to more than just a location. It refers to services. And students, by law, must be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. That is what we call least restrictive environment. And you will hear least restrictive environment or LRE in most conversations that you have regarding students with disabilities receiving special education. It is all about having access to general education curriculum with their non-disabled peers. That is the least restrictive environment. And a student's parent must be part of any group that makes decisions about the educational placement of their child. I do get phone calls where parents say to me, the school called and they're moving my child to X location. Okay, well, let's refer back to Section 7 of the IEP and educational placement and remind the IEP team that a parent is always part of that discussion. Schools should not be telling you where your student is going to be going. They should be discussing with you and getting your input on what is the appropriate placement. The IEP team must give adequate consideration to placement of the student in the general education classroom with supplementary aids and services. And we talked about supplementary aids and services in the last section, SAS. Those are supports that happen in general education. IEP teams are expected to discuss if this child was in general education, are there appropriate supports that we could bring in to that classroom to help this child be successful? Sometimes the answer is yes, these are the supports that we can bring in that will do that. Sometimes the answer is no, we need to do this in a different location with in a different environment that will help the student be successful. It's not to say that students sometimes don't, it's not to say that students don't need to go to another location sometimes. A learning support classroom that's down the hall from their regular class, and a completely different building that offers a program that's ideal for a student to be successful, and outside of district placement. Sometimes those things are appropriate and necessary to support a student, but it should not be the starting point. They should always consider, if the child is in general education, are there appropriate supplementary aids and services that could help this child to succeed right here where they are. Listed are the following 4 questions that must be considered. These questions are in every IEP. They're, if you have your IEP and you get it out and you take a look at Section 7, the 4 questions are listed on the IEP. Teams have to ask these questions, answer them, and document in the IEP what their answers are. What supplementary aids or services were considered? What benefits are provided in the general education class with these supplementary aids and services versus the benefits that are provided in the special education class? So they really want you to weigh what are the benefits in one environment versus another. What you don't want to see in this section of your student's IEP are these really general kind of answers. What was considered? Well, we considered just putting them in general ed with no supports, and we thought that wasn't a good idea. And we considered putting them in a full-time autistic support classroom, but we didn't think that was a good idea. And so we landed somewhere in the middle and we're doing this. That's kind of overgeneralizing what this section of the IEP is really meant to do, which is to take a look at the specific student, the specific student's needs, and how we can support them best. Is it in the general ed environment? If it's not, why isn't that going to work? What's better about being in the special ed environment? Maybe it is better to be in the special ed classroom, and that's okay. But we're not putting a student there just because of diagnosis or just because, you know, we don't just put autistic students in the autistic support classroom. We really look at what are the students' needs, where can they best be addressed, and how are we going to do that? So again, this is a part that's listed in every IEP that I think very often we go through really quickly and just say, yeah, okay, yeah, educational placement. We asked all the 4 questions. That's great. Educational placement will determine two things, and these are both listed in the IEP: the amount of special education support and the type of special education support. The amount of special education support can be itinerant, which is 20% or less of the school day is provided by special education personnel. Supplemental, which is more than 20 but less than 80, so that's supplemental special education, or full-time, which is special education supports and services provided for 80% or more of the day. The key to this is provided by special education personnel. So if you have a student who has a specific learning disability and they are going to see a reading specialist who is a general education teacher with a reading specialist certification, that teacher is not a special education teacher. That does not count as time in special education. The services have to be delivered by a special education professional. So itinerant, less than 20, supplemental, 20 to 80, full-time, anything 80% or above. That is how you determine the amount of special education. The type of special education supports, these are the categories that are provided by the Pennsylvania Department of Education: autistic support, blind visually impaired support, deaf and hard of hearing support, emotional support, learning support, life skills support, multi-disability support, physical support, speech and language support. Now, these are based on the type of support the student is receiving, not necessarily the child's diagnosis or qualifying disability. For example, you can have an autistic student who's diagnosed with autism, who qualifies for special education based on their disability of autism, whose special education supports is learning support, because they are receiving supports from the learning support teacher focusing on academic achievement. So even though the student is autistic, even though their qualifying disability is autism, they may not necessarily be receiving autistic supports. They could be receiving learning support, life skills support, emotional support, although that's one that can be challenging, because if a student is receiving emotional support, but their behavior is related to autism, the question that I always recommend parents ask is emotional support the right answer for that? Is there an approach using itinerant autistic support or supplemental autistic support that might better meet those behavior needs? That would depend, obviously, on the individual student, but it is something to consider. Physical support relates mostly to those students who have a physical disability that impacts their ability to access their education. It's not just a kid who might be receiving a little PT. Students can receive more than one type of special education support. So you could have a child who's having autistic support, learning support, speech and language support. Sometimes deaf, hard of hearing supports are at, it doesn't have to be one, or there can be multiple. All right, questions about educational placement before I go to the last part of the IEP and then open it up for any questions that anybody has just overall. All righty. The last part of an IEP, which you will see at the very back with lots of charts and percentages, is called the Penn data reporting. I find one of two things is usually the case with Penn data reporting. Either nobody ever even got to them because there was so much to talk about, and the IEP meeting already took an hour and 40 minutes, and we just don't have time to talk about the Penn data reporting. Or the parents took a look at it and were like, I have no idea what this is saying. My husband has a saying, clear as mud. And I honestly think that sometimes the Penn data reporting is clear as mud. However, it is included in every IEP. The things to remember about Penn data reporting are, these are more of an evaluation, the reporting related to how school districts are performing and not specifically related to an individual student. The data is gathered on a school district basis. It's also reported out based on school district. I linked to the Penn data reporting. You can go take a look at your school district from any given year that's been posted and see how schools are doing. It's particularly related to inclusion, but it's worded, and when you take a look at your IEPs, you will see it is worded like almost as a double negative. It's not about the amount of special education a student receives. It's not about how much special ed they receive. It's about how much time are they included with their non-disabled peers. And the language is really, it's really like, when are they not included with their non-disabled? And so it gets a little like, when are they not included with their non-disabled peers? So it's really taking a look at how much time are they not with gen ed. So the calculations are based on, oh, well, this student leaves for speech for 20 minutes a week. So during that period of time, they are not with their general education peers. When else are they not with non-disabled peers? Well, they go to the learning support room for 20 minutes every day. So for 20 minutes every day, they are not with their peers. So that it's a very specific calculation based on time away from non-disabled peers. And then that is reported first to Harrisburg and then ultimately to the U.S. Department of Education that collects data on how school districts are doing basically and making sure that students are having access to learning with their non-disabled peers. So that's linked there. I had a couple of other resources that I linked here. One is on extended school year, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So this is the link to information on extended school year. Above that is the PATN. PATN is the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. PATN has a lot of great resources. If you haven't checked out their website, I highly recommend it. But this is a link to PATN's annotated IEP. Most of the information that I talked about tonight is included in PATN's annotated form of the IEP. You can download it, you can print it. It basically gives you an example of this is what an IEP looks like. This is what goes in every section. These are things that parents should think about. These are things that IEP teams should consider. It's a really, really great resource, and it will reference most of what we talked about here tonight. So I have the link for that as well, and I will make sure that that gets sent out. Last slide is just my contact information that you can reach out to me with questions. My number is there. My email address is there. And if you have questions this evening, I am really happy to take questions. I want to stop the recording. I wanted to keep my contact information up for a second, but let me do this.